recorded. The presentation slides have a lot of great information. They're going to be made available to you following the FRAC conference. Great reference material in the future. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Today's session is unfunded but essential. It's a particular subject that I'm passionate about. I think unfunded or non-financial agreements don't get the attention that they need. So we're going to be looking at how we can streamline and mitigate risk associated with non-financial or unfunded agreements. Next slide, please. My name is Jeff. I'm currently the director of the contracts office at the University of Central Florida. I was previously the director of the Ancillary Research Agreements team at the University of California, San Diego. In both positions, I manage a group of contracts officers that work and negotiate non-financial agreements. My colleague, Rebecca, is currently the assistant director of the contracts office in the Office of Research here at UCF. She previously worked at Clemson University as an associate program director in the research division, where she led drafting, review, and negotiation of research-related agreements, and as assistant general counsel, where she functioned as the primary contact for legal issues related to research, including contracts, compliance, and intellectual property. Next slide, please. All right, so as the research administration profession evolves beyond traditional proposal and award functions within sponsor programs office, new rules, regulations, requirements from sponsors, and compliance issues have led to an exponential rise in the need for these unfunded or non-financial agreements. This in turn has led many sponsor program offices to consider more strategic approaches to managing these types of agreements. Next slide, please. So today's learning objectives. We're going to go through and identify the various types of unfunded agreements a university can encounter. We're going to better understand the different models for how to institutionally manage this growing area of research contracting. We're also going to gain insight into negotiation strategies for these types of agreements and review compliance considerations. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. As Jeff mentioned, one of our learning objectives for today is to talk about the various types of unfunded agreements that you may encounter as a research administrator. So before we get into the different types, I think it's important that we first define exactly what we're talking about when we refer to an unfunded agreement, exactly what falls under that umbrella. And as you can see here, an unfunded agreement, or a non-financial agreement, as they're sometimes called, is a contract between two parties, absent extramural funding, that may be required by a sponsor, agency, or industry partner in the furtherance of research. When I bring new contracts officers into the team, I also often tell them to think of this in very basic, simple terms as, are we receiving any money? Is any money coming into our institution? If so, it's funded. If we're not getting any funds coming in, consider it non-financial. Break down the unfunded agreements into two main types. They can be, for example, a data use agreement to obtain a data set, which will be used in unfunded research, or they can be related to another specific funded research agreement that you may have or will be negotiating. So an example here would be a non-disclosure agreement whose purpose is to allow for discussions related to a potential funding opportunity. Next slide, please. Our first type of unfunded agreements that I think for many of us is the most frequent that we encounter are non-disclosure agreements. A non-disclosure agreement can sometimes also be called a confidentiality agreement or a confidential disclosure agreement. They're all just different terms for the same thing. These are contracts that define specific confidential information which will be shared for a specific purpose, and which defines the obligations of each party regarding the use and protection of that specific confidential information. Next slide, please. The next type of unfunded agreement that I want to talk about is a data use agreement. These may also be fairly frequent in your office. They can also be referred to as data use and transfer agreements. And these are contracts that provide access to a specific data set or a database for research use. You also may see equipment loan agreements, also sometimes known as bailment agreements. So don't be surprised if you see that title come through on your contract type. These are contracts that allow for temporary use of another party's equipment. And you may also receive in your office material transfer agreements, or MTAs. These are contracts that provide access to specific materials for research purposes. I want to note that all three of the types of agreements on this page, as well as the non-disclosure agreements that we previously discussed, can be either one-way or two-way agreements. In a one-way agreement, one party is providing that confidential information, data, equipment, or materials to the other party. And in a two-way, there's an exchange where you may have that confidential information, data, equipment, or materials coming in and out of your institution. It's important to keep this in mind because, as we're going to discuss later when we talk about some of the contract negotiation strategies, the specific terms that are most ideal for you and the bargaining position that you find yourself in may be dependent on whether it is a one-way agreement, a two-way agreement, or if something is coming in or being sent out from your institution. As a quick example, I'll give you with non-disclosure agreements, many of us find that we have specific terms that we like to limit them to so that confidential information is only protected for a certain amount of time when we're receiving confidential information. However, should the situation be such that we only have outgoing confidential information, we may be more lenient in allowing the longer term because it's really to our institution's benefit that our institution would have its confidential information protected longer if that was the term that was proposed. Next slide, please. Another type of unfunded agreement that you may see come your way is a software license agreement, which is a contract that outlines user requirements and restrictions for using or accessing specific software. You may also encounter teaming agreements, which are agreements that outline the roles of each party in relation to a proposal submission. So if two parties want to work together on preparing a proposal, they may choose to enter a teaming agreement to formalize that relationship and the role that each party will play in developing that specific submission. Another type that you may see is a memorandum of understanding or a letter agreement, which is an agreement which is typically non-binding, which establishes the roles of each party in a collaboration. And Jeff will touch on this further in our later discussion, but I do want to offer a word of caution when you are dealing with memoranda of understanding to note that we've underlined specifically that these are non-binding. A true MOU is in fact non-binding, and there should be explicit language in the agreement stating that the terms are non-binding and that there are no legal obligations created for either party in the agreement. I think a natural question that comes from that is, if this agreement is non-binding and there's no legal obligations, then why are we doing this? I've definitely asked myself that early in my career, and still now from time to time. And it sometimes does involve a very tactful conversation with your faculty member to understand the purpose. But for the most part, the times when I've seen that these can really be valuable is when we're trying to establish a relationship. So there may be some high level discussions that are happening, a very high profile between two parties, and perhaps they want to issue a press release or have an article go out in the paper about how they're going to be working together, and they want to be able to say, look how we're going to be working together, and we're so committed to this that we've entered this MOU. Of course, the unwritten part of that is that there's not actually anything formalized or decided in the MOU. All those discussions will be to come, and perhaps memorialized in more formal agreements later.
Okay, if I may add, I think
sure.
A lot of universities may find MOUs coming out of their international collaboration offices. Those groups that are responsible for developing partnerships with entities outside the United States. And so they want to document that interest in engaging further. And typically in those situations, an MOU is that starting point. It's an opportunity for them to document their areas of interest, what they're hoping to do together, but it's not legally binding, and most likely will lead to an additional agreement in the future that is actually legally binding. So I've collaborated a lot in my career on these MOUs with the international collaboration offices or the global affairs offices at the institutions I worked at.
That's a great point that Jeff brings up. And I have found that as well, that sometimes, especially with these international organizations, there may be different cultural norms that they want to follow that lead to them wanting to have this MOU as a first step in the relationship building process. Next slide. And another type of unfunded agreement that we wanted to talk about was the unfunded collaboration agreement, which may also be called an unfunded research agreement or a research collaboration agreement. And this is a contract that outlines the scope of work for a research project in which each party agrees to fund its own work. There may be some similarities to the funded research agreement, but there's no money that's being exchanged. Each party is internally funding its activities, but there still may be very detailed scopes of work, explicit discussion of who is having each roles and responsibilities for the project. There may be IP and other terms that you would typically find in a funded project, but there's no money that's exchanging hands. And finally, we have our catch-all category of all other miscellaneous unfunded agreements, which do not fall under any of the other categories that we've already talked about, and which do not clearly belong to another office that may end up in your queue in your sponsored programs office. And some examples of these are visiting scholar agreements, CRADAs, BAAs, allocation of rights, or other IP agreements. And it's really going to depend on your specific institution, structure, and processes as far as whether you will see these agreements and how frequently. For example, at some universities, visiting scholar agreements may be handled by their international office and would never touch your desk. At some institutions, allocation of rights agreements and IP agreements are handled by a tech transfer office solely. So it really kind of depends on how you have structured things at your institution as far as whether these may come under your umbrella for unfunded agreements. Next slide, please.
There's different approaches depending on the structure of your institution on how to manage these unfunded agreements. I think after we went through the definitions of what these unfunded agreements are, you would agree with us that these are essential and just as important as financial agreements for the progress of research at your institution. However, historically, they may have taken a backseat at your institution to those financial agreements because there isn't a dollar amount attached to them. So how can we manage these unfunded agreements? Next slide. So depending on the organizational structure of your institution, not all unfunded agreements will be reviewed and negotiated by a SPO. As Becca mentioned, an international office may handle certain agreements, a technology transfer office may handle certain agreements. So it's sort of dependent on how these assignments have been made. Some institutions separate federal and nonprofit proposals and awards from industry contracts. The non-financial agreements might follow that same approach. Other institutions delegate industry contracts or material transfer agreements to their technology transfer office. You can understand, especially with outgoing material transfer agreements, you're actually sending university materials out to a third party. So it would make sense that the technology transfer office at your institution would be involved in such an agreement. Next slide. So unfunded agreements may be handled by the same contract and grant officers responsible for proposal and review and award negotiation setup. That's a model that's used by a lot of institutions. However, there's also different models. Because the primary focus of SPOs has traditionally been award setup, project initiation, getting those financial agreements set up, those proposals submitted, unfunded agreements may have sat around. They may have not been a top priority, and the negotiation execution timeline for those agreements may have taken longer than a funded contract. Next slide, please. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different models that we can have for unfunded agreements. So the first model. Next slide, please. So unfunded agreements at University A are handled by a variety of different offices. So non-disclosure agreements, data use agreements, software licensing agreements, and equipment loan agreements are handled by the Technology Transfer Office. Collaboration agreements are the only ones handled by the Central SPO office. The agreements are shared in emails between departments and central offices. No central repository, no electronic research administration system for them. The challenges faced by this model is that there's difficulty locating prior versions of an agreement. So if you're trying to leverage work that another officer did with the same entity negotiating a CDA, you don't have an ERA system that are managing these unfunded agreements. You're not going to be able to easily access that non-disclosure agreement. Contracts officers are heavily focused on proposal deadlines and funded agreements. So, these unfunded agreements, especially if they're not being tracked, can definitely fall through the cracks. There's a lack of transparency for PIs and department research administrators. If there's no system where these are being logged, how is the PI and department supposed to understand where they are in the process? There's going to be a lot of follow-up to make sure that they didn't fall through the cracks, a lot of back and forth. So there's a lot of challenges with an approach like this. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so University B, unfunded agreements are handled by a designated team as a distinct transaction type. So at this institution, unfunded agreements are actually a service line. So proposals, awards, unfunded agreements. It's called out, it's part of a team's responsibility, and it's not grouped in the same way that proposals and awards are. And that way, unfunded agreements are managed in the same way and have the same priority as these funded agreements because you have a team that is designated to work on them. They're also in the same electronic research administration system. So you're able to track it. You're able to tie these non-financial agreements to these financial agreements in the system and create a history for the project. What contractual obligations do you have for a particular project? If you have both non-financial and financial agreements in the same system and you're able to link them, you have a better understanding of that in the future. PIs and department research administrators can track these non-financial agreements. They know how many agreements that a PI has. A PI can understand what is active, what do they have with the company. And if they've submitted it and you're ongoing in negotiation, they can actually look in the system, okay, my contracts officer is still working on it, but I know that they're actually working on it. I know that it hasn't fallen through the cracks. What this sort of approach does is it develops a specialized intake. What they can do is develop a specialized intake request form in collaboration with their compliance partners. So looking at export control, conflict of interest, technology transfer. So these offices that you're going to engage with the financial agreements, you're also going to work with on these financial agreements. So what can you do from the beginning to capture this information so you can identify compliance issues or obtain the necessary information to partner with these compliance offices? So you're going to reduce some back and forth if you have these questions asked up front, and you're going to establish a more complete picture of the request from the beginning so the contracts officer can initiate their review of the agreement upon receipt of the request. It's really helpful as a contracts officer with unfunded agreements or any type of agreement to have a clear picture of what is going to be covered by the agreement, what sort of projects going to be worked on, what activities are going to occur, who's going to be involved. Some of these non-financial agreements have particular export control concerns. You want to know who's involved in the project. So getting that up front, having it from the beginning, creates transparency and it makes it easier for everyone. Next slide, please.
Next, we want to talk about the UCF model. And I think we all have our own biases, oftentimes thinking our way is the best way. But in all seriousness, Jeff and I genuinely believe that there's a lot of really positive aspects to the way that we handle our unfunded agreements here at the University of Central Florida, which may be useful and transferable to some of you in either in whole or in part at your institutions, in which we wanted to share. Next slide, please. So the UCF model involves intake and management of unfunded agreements handled in generally the same way as our funded agreements. We have an electronic research administration system that we use here at UCF, through which our principal investigator, with the support and oftentimes through the department administrator, will submit their agreement or their request for an agreement into the electronic system. They create a new record for it. They answer some questions in what we call our SMART form. It's an electronic form that gives us various pieces of information about the agreement specifics. They hit the submit button, at which point it gets transferred over to our intake specialist in the contract office, our central sponsored programs office, through that online portal. The intake specialist reviews the record for the new agreement request. She ensures that our naming conventions are used, that certain data fields are completely entered and entered correctly. And if anything is missing, she will go back and work together with the principal investigator and the department to make sure that the record is completed, essentially ensuring that when she then assigns it over to the appropriate contracts officer, that it is a record that is actionable, that they are able to take it and to begin their review, begin a negotiation, and take instant action on it. The assignments that are made to the contracts officers are based on both the department and the complexity of the agreement. We have a matrix that we have developed and used, which is adjusted from time to time, which assigns specific departmental portfolios to our contracts officers, allowing them to get familiar with the research that is done in their assigned departments and to build relationships with their faculty and their departmental contacts, but then also considers complexity of agreements, so that there, for most areas, are two different contracts officers assigned, a more entry-level contracts officer who handles what we generally consider our simpler agreements, and a more advanced contract officer who handles the more difficult, complex agreement types. All of these agreements are treated as part of their workload with the same urgency as the funded agreements. So they may take into account considerations such as deadlines or specific urgencies that are indicated by the PI in the department, certain priority contracts that we may be aware of. But for the most part, things are handled first come, first served basis, so that all the agreements can continue to keep moving in an efficient way, both the unfunded and the funded together. We also assess the volume regularly in our leadership team meetings, so that shifts can be made as needed to ensure swift processing and an equitable distribution of workload amongst the team. So for example, if the university had several new faculty join in our College of Medicine who are very research active, they were bringing a lot of materials with them from their previous universities, we might get a large influx of material transfer agreements. We would want to look at that increased volume to consider maybe our individual who normally handles material transfer agreements from the College of Medicine might need some assistance. The other contract officer assigned to that area may be able to help in, as well as other members of the contracts team who might have some capacity at that point. So we have a structure that is set forth to allow for some clarity, some consistency, some efficiency, but we also have that flexibility built in where we can assess different situations as they come up and pivot as needed. Next slide, please.
Well, I do agree with Becca. We have a great process and system for these non-financial unfunded agreements at UCF. In discussing the process, one can clearly see that it is dependent on our electronic research administration and the data that we're able to pull out of that. We are very fortunate that we have a supportive IT group that understands our business process and helps us obtain the necessary data so that we can manage these unfunded agreements based on volume, so that we ensure that they're moving just as quickly through the process as the financial agreements. Next slide, please. So the intake processes and ERA systems provide the opportunity for pulling data on the volume, type of unfunded agreements executed at a university, and types of organizations your institution is entering into contracts with. So looking at the process for inputting those agreements into your system, and the ERA system that can track it, what sort of data points you can pull out of it. This data is beneficial for ensuring that your institution understands the scope of unfunded agreements and devotes the necessary resources. Traditionally, institutional leadership has looked at reports of financial agreements. They're looking at the number of financial agreements that are being brought in, the dollar amounts, and unfunded agreements, if they're not included in the reports or they're not reported separately, may be an area of volume that is not being addressed by leadership. You may not have the resources to manage those agreements. So being able to report on them, being able to understand what sort of entities you're working with, what types of agreements will help justify the resources that you need to negotiate and execute those contracts. The data may also be used for compliance purposes as requirements for reporting on agreements with foreign entities are expanding. If you don't understand what sort of contractual relationships your university is entering into, even if they're non-financial, you may run into a situation where you're asked to pull data on a particular sponsor type, location, and you're unable to do so. You may be able to pull it on financial agreements, but if you're not tracking non-financial agreements the same way, that's going to be a gap in reporting. And if that's part of it, it could be a compliance issue, it could be an audit issue. Next slide, please. Unfunded agreements may be overlooked. So I mentioned this before. So if they're not included in standard agreements, it may be something that your staff become overwhelmed. They do require a similar amount of time and effort as a financial agreement. You're negotiating similar terms. You look at an unfunded collaboration agreement. The only thing there that's missing is the financial terms. Otherwise, you're looking at intellectual property, liability, indemnification. You're going to be taking the same amount of time as a financial agreement to negotiate that document. Some of these agreements, like a material transfer agreement, may actually take longer, depending on the circumstances, depending on the material, what sort of compliance partners need to be involved. So it really just depends, and making sure that you can tell your story about these unfunded agreements to leadership so you have the necessary resources is important. Using data and reporting to assist with the workload management of contracts officers is also another approach that can help prevent volume being an issue for your negotiation timeline. Becca mentioned this. We regularly look at the volume of the contracts officers to ensure that we are having an equitable distribution of workload. We're looking at complexity. We're looking at number of contracts. We all know that looking at just a number, so this person has 10 contracts, doesn't provide you a complete picture of what is exactly on that person's desk. So being able to pull out the types of contracts, so being able to pull out how many CDAs they have, how many sponsored research agreements they have, how many MTAs, provides management a better understanding of the volume that each officer is working on and can help support that staff that sees an increase in their volume. When you're working in a department-based assignment model, you may have certain times of the year where a department sees a significant increase in their volume, and you need to provide that contracts officer support. You need to provide them backup so that they're able to move those contracts along. It's an up and down thing. It's cyclical. Sometimes, there's a low volume for a particular area of campus. Sometimes there's a high volume. It's not sort of, equal. So you need to be able to pivot and address those volume issues, and data and reporting is the best way to do it. And to truly understand the volume of a particular area, you need to include unfunded agreements in that data. Next slide, please. All right, contract negotiation strategies. So we've talked about this in that unfunded agreements have similar issues as financial agreements. But there's some areas that you want to focus on. Next slide, please. So negotiation strategies. What is in a name? So when it comes to contracts, whether they're funded or unfunded, you're going to have to review them. You're going to have to negotiate them potentially. So you're going to have to spend time with them. So I'm saying, let's forget about the name of the agreement. Let's focus on what the terms and conditions are and what the agreement covers. So for non-disclosure agreements, is there a duty to mark or identify or clearly communicate to the receiving party that the information being shared is confidential? How are you supposed to know that information being shared with you is confidential unless it's clearly labeled as such, or if you're discussing it with a sponsor or another party, it is communicated to you and then reduced to writing? I mean, that's the preferred position for a university. We have an open academic environment, students coming in and out of our laboratories, We need to be able to clearly identify that information which is confidential to ensure that we're not sharing it incorrectly. If you have a CDA that doesn't require the marking of confidential information, you run into the risk of that confidential information being disclosed in conflict with the terms and conditions that it's been shared. Is the definition of confidential information too broad? Is the purpose of the agreement too broad? What are we receiving this information for? What are we doing with this information? What are they doing with this information? It's not just that information that we receive from the other party, it's that which we share. We have proprietary information at the university that we want to be protected. We want to make sure that the purpose or use of that confidential information is limited just to what is necessary for the purposes of the discussion, for the collaboration, for understanding what we're doing with this other party. Export control. Export control is an area of compliance that we'll get into later in this presentation, but with an NDA, you're receiving proprietary confidential information or you're sharing it. There may be export control considerations to take into account when you're negotiating it, when you're communicating the PI, and you may need to involve export control in the review process for that CDA. Next slide, please. Data transfer and use agreements. These are a growing area of contracting for a university. I think, looking back in my career, there was always encouraged, share this information, collaborate. But now we're getting into the situation where we have privacy laws that need to be taken into consideration, GDPR, HIPAA, FERPA. If we are to transfer data that is subject to these privacy laws, we need to ensure that there are terms and conditions in place with the other party that communicates the requirements for that data clearly. I'm a huge fan of the Federal Demonstration Partnership Data Transfer and Use Agreement. It's a fantastic tool, has streamlined the negotiation for data use agreements. It provides amazing resources in what these different types of data are. What is a limited data set? What is personally identifiable information? What does a PI need to know to identify what type of data they're sharing? And not only that, it also makes the negotiation execution very easy when you're working with another institution that is, going to accept that template. One thing you need to consider really closely, what is the flow of data? Just like confidential information, just like a material transfer agreement, what is being shared, who's receiving, who is sending? That way you can make sure that you understand what your institution's role is in the project. If you're sharing the data, so you can share the data, but retaining ownership and publication rights for that data. Just because you're sharing it, just because you're providing that entity access, doesn't mean that they own it, doesn't mean that they can block your publication of that data. To be frank with you, there may be situations where you want to control what they're doing with that data, depending on what regulations are applicable to that data, depending where that data was generated, what sort of use can they have with that data? So what are the security requirements for storing and accessing the data? You may need to have certain IT security requirements depending on the type of data. So working with an IT security specialist at your institution, we have a great relationship with our cybersecurity office. We also work very closely with our privacy officer here. And really, those are the subject matter experts, and being able to reach out to them during the course of a negotiation with DUA is very valuable for the staff. Next slide, please. Unfunded collaboration agreements. Well, we touched upon this previously, but they're essentially the same thing as a sponsored research agreement, just without an exchange of funding. There's an opportunity for intellectual property to be developed. You want to make sure that both parties are contributing to the development of that collaboration. So you want to make sure that it's not lopsided. So if it's truly a collaboration, both parties are bringing something to the table, and you want to protect that intellectual property coming out of that collaboration. Sharing of data, really an unfunded agreement, unfunded collaboration agreement can be a Frankenstein type agreement. You can have materials be exchanged, data be exchanged, confidential information. It's pretty much a catch-all, except for funding. Next slide, please. Equipment loan agreements. This is an opportunity for your institution to share a piece of equipment, or another institution share equipment with you, a company to share equipment with you. And what that's going to include are terms and conditions for how that equipment can be used. So having a relationship with your equipment management group on campus so that they understand when this equipment is coming in, what do they need to be doing? Do they need to be labeling it? Do they need to be tracking it? What are obligations at the end of the term for the equipment loan agreement? Do we need to return it, or do we need to destroy it? What sort of obligations we have? A situation stands out in my memory where we were working on an equipment loan agreement, and we were working with a PI and a department, and they understood as a space being available for them to bring in this equipment. It was massive. It would take up a whole laboratory. So they were committing this space. But when we followed up a little bit more on the availability of that space, it became clear that they didn't necessarily have all the approvals that they needed to occupy that space with this piece of equipment. So if you don't follow up on these sort of questions about equipment, you can run into a situation where you have a large piece of equipment delivered to your institution and nowhere to put it, nowhere to use it. So asking things like, where is this equipment going to go? In this space, is it received all the necessary approvals? What can we do with this equipment? What is the liability associated with this equipment? What are we using it for? Are we using it on human subjects? Are we using it in the course of other types of research? Are we using it in the performance of sponsored research? Is there any opportunity for conflicting obligations? Let's say we use the equipment and develop some data. Is the company that is loaning us the equipment going to want to use that data for a specific purpose, and can we allow them to use it? I've even seen in equipment loan agreements where the company wants to restrict our use, that it can't be used in any research funded by a competitor. Well, what's a competitor? And how are you going to restrict our freedom like that? And how could we manage such an obligation? What sort of controls could we put in place to actually prevent someone from using that equipment with funding coming from a competitor of the company that loaned it to us? So these are questions when you're working through a piece of equipment, and having a dialogue with your principal investigator, understanding what activities are going to occur with that equipment, what the future plans are for that equipment, and making sure that the agreement reflects it. I also have seen situations where the other party wants us to restrict any sort of sharing of information resulting from our use of that equipment. So what if the equipment doesn't work as anticipated? What if we have a negative experience? They didn't want us to publish that sort of information. Well, we need to protect our researchers' ability to do so. So having the conversations with the companies, making sure they understand what we have on our side as concerns from the very beginning when you start that conversation. Next slide, please. MOUs. As we mentioned before, these are non-binding, usually very high level, low risk. Something where, again, you're talking about intent, potentially an agreement to enter into an agreement in the future. MOUs are typically, very short, not including a lot of terms and conditions. Understanding the why is probably the most fundamental question. Is this really a necessary agreement to put in place? Maybe it's just the process for the other party, depending on sort of what their practices are. But again, a lower risk type agreement. Next slide, please. Software license agreements. So software license agreements can come in different ways at a university. Let's say you're procuring a software license agreement. So you're going to go through your procurement office. What if that software license agreement is non-financial, where you're not paying for anything? The company or the entity is providing you access to that software for free. That may come through a central SPO office. Same thing for software licenses agreements as it is for equipment loan agreements. What sort of restrictions on publications are they including in that agreement? Are they restricting your ability to publish any sort of data resulting from your use of that software? What about your experience utilizing that software? Feedback. What about feedback? What if the company is engaging with your PI and is asking for feedback based on their use of that software? Who owns that feedback? Many companies are going to want to own that feedback. They're going to want to own that input provided by the PI, and you need to have a conversation with them to understand, what is this software being used for? What sort of obligations do we have for those projects already existing? What can we do with any sort of input provided by the PI? Data rights, making sure that we own the data, even if it is a result of our use of that software. Teaming agreement. So a teaming agreement, my first question is this a sponsor requirement? Because teaming agreements typically come in at the proposal stage and as a sponsor requirement to document the collaborators' commitment to working together. So is this a requirement? If not, is it truly necessary? We all want to support the research enterprise at our institutions, but we don't want to create unnecessary administrative burden on the staff. We don't want to put agreements in place that aren't necessary. We're setting up, legal agreements for the institution. If they're not necessary, if they're not beneficial, let's not do that. So that's always my first question. Is this a sponsor requirement? If so, absolutely happy to help you with getting this in place. What's the deadline? What is the scope of work? Do we already have the project in place? Is it something post-award that came up, or is this pre-award? Where are we in the process? And again, a TA can get you into a message territory if the agreement starts to dictate the scope of work and deliverables. So you have a teaming agreement, you may have a sponsor research agreement, and you're getting into a situation where everything is very restricted. So making sure that you're looking at is something valuable and not something that is going to negatively impact the research. Next slide, please. Material transfer agreements. At the University of Central Florida, we handle incoming material transfer agreements in the SPO office. That is the receipt of materials from an external party. Outgoing material transfer agreements are handled by our technology transfer office. It's important to understand what the material is, how it is defined. It needs to be very specific. We want to make sure that we know what we're getting and that it is the other parties. What intellectual property rights are we granting back to the provider as part of our use of the material? When looking at material transfer agreements with other academic institutions, you're going to be relying on those, very widely accepted templates, such as the UBMTA or the Autumn templates. That's going to be an efficient negotiation. It's when you get into industry MTAs, you may run into a significant amount of negotiation. They're going to want to own everything that comes out of your use of that material, and you need to ensure that you're piecing it apart. So yes, they're going to continue to own that material, but you need to own the intellectual property that results from the research with that material. Other agreements, a catch-all, again, it could be a CRADA, it could be a BAA. It's an opportunity for us to capture that miscellaneous category. So we have another agreement category in our electronic research administration system. And it's useful. It's useful for the PIs and departments. If they're submitting a record to us with an agreement, they don't have a clear understanding of what that agreement is, they can choose other agreement. But it's also important for us to look back and say, well, is this more appropriately classified as a material transfer agreement or as a CDA, so that we can have clean data and we know what we have out there. But there may be a situation where it truly is another agreement that doesn't fit into a category. And you just negotiate it based on the facts of the situation. What is going to occur under this agreement? What do we need to do? Next slide, please.
Okay, so compliance considerations. Just like with funded agreements, there can be a whole variety of compliance considerations that come into play when you're dealing with unfunded agreements. Slide, please. The first one that I want to talk about is technology transfer and intellectual property. We often think about having the really challenging, difficult IP negotiations when we have a funded agreement with an industry partner or perhaps a particularly complex master agreement. But challenging IP terms can still come into play in some of these non-financial agreements as well. For example, with unfunded collaboration agreements, they may require negotiation of background IP, foreground IP, and sometimes even licensing, depending on the type of research that's being conducted. IP agreements are also now required by some federal sponsors at the time of proposal submission, and they generally require input by our colleagues in the Office of Technology Transfer. These can sometimes include several different parties and can also involve very extensive negotiation, particularly when you're dealing with industry partners. I'll note here as well that it can come up in other types of unfunded agreements as well. I've seen parties try to sneak IP terms into a non-disclosure agreement. I've had some very challenging negotiations before dealing with IP terms in a material transfer agreement. As Jeff mentioned before, when we're receiving materials into our institutions, we're often not in a very good negotiating position. Unlike funded agreements where there may be specific deliverables and some tangible items of value that the sponsor sees that they're getting out of the exchange, when we are being provided with incoming materials, that's not necessarily the case. So the other party, we really not want to budge from their negotiating position, but they may want to ask for something like some ownership or rights to improvements that come out of the material use which may be problematic for our faculty depending on what they're doing with those materials. Also, another concern to be aware of is export control. This often comes up when we're dealing with non-disclosure agreements. At UCF, we have instituted a review process where our contract officers ask some initial questions to get some initial information to try to identify information that may be disclosed under a non-disclosure agreement that may not be subject to the safe harbor protections under the fundamental research exclusion. There are times when those questions can be answered and we can determine that we are protected and it is appropriate for us to move on with negotiations. There are other times where, depending on the answers that it receives, we have to loop in our colleagues in our export control office. And we have an ancillary review process that we use to do that through our electronic research administration system. So that we can send those agreements for review and they can be more thoroughly vetted by our colleagues in export control. We also have other types of agreements that may bring export control issues into play. For example, software licensing agreements where the software is developmental and it might not be classified as dual use. Those may require an export license in order to be shared. International agreements also are definitely an area where you should be thinking export control. These have been subject to much closer scrutiny in recent years based on foreign influence concerns, as well as new regulations that have been issued by several federal sponsors. For any type of international collaborations, we strongly recommend discussing the project specifics with your export control officer, if possible. It's always our practice to be on the safe side when it comes to export control. Next slide, please. Another issue that you may want to consider, depending very much on your institutional policies and structure, is whether a review or involvement may be needed by your risk management office or campus council. Depending on your specific institution's risk tolerance, you may need to develop a process for escalating certain agreements to a risk management department or to an office of legal affairs. Additionally, an unfunded agreement may require further legal review based on the project, the type of agreement, and your specific institutional policies. For example, if your institution has certain limitations on indemnifying another party to an agreement that you come across that has non-standard indemnification language may require escalation to one of those two offices. Additionally, you should be thinking with unfunded agreements about data use considerations. Based on the type of data that's being transmitted, approval or review might be required from one of several different compliance departments on your campus. And as Jeff mentioned previously, we work very closely with our privacy office, who might need to be looped in if we were to receive an agreement that involved the collection of data or information about residents of the European Union that could be subject to GDPR. Also, agreements with clauses about data security requirements or standards may require your IT department to be consulted to ensure that compliance with specific requirements is met as related to IT security. And again, depending on your specific institution, this could be a central IT department, or it could be a IT unit within a specific academic unit that's going to be involved in activities under that contract. Next slide, please. In our experiences, export control and technology transfer are typically the most common issues that come up when reviewing unfunded agreements. However, also keep in mind that a contracts officer can and often does serve in a gatekeeper function to connect their faculty with other compliance areas to ensure that proper protocols are in place to carry out the activities that are contemplated by that unfunded agreement. So for example, if there's indications in the agreement that human subjects research is going to be occurring, there may be a need to confirm that the IRB has already been or is going to be looped in. Similarly, if there is going to be use of live vertebrate animals, the IACUC, your Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, may need to be involved. Or if you have hazardous materials that are going to come into play, perhaps being received into the institution through a material transfer agreement, you would want to loop in your biosafety committee for their review. There are some additional considerations that depend again on your agreement type and your institution. For example, I learned in preparing this presentation with Jeff that state-funded institutions in the state of California must report any agreements that are related to cannabis. I did not know that prior to preparing this presentation. Really good reminder.
One of the great things about unfunded agreements like this is you can encounter these situations that you wouldn't typically run into when you're negotiating your traditional sponsored research agreement. You're going to run into unique issues with material transfer agreements, compliance issues that you have never encountered before. You're going to get very familiar with privacy issues. You're going to really develop professionally. It's not just an opportunity to work on something interesting. It gets you experience and exposure to issues that you wouldn't work on traditionally with, your federal contracts or your industry funded contracts. So I love unfunded agreements just for the variety. They're essential just as much as sponsored research agreements to the performance of research at your institution. And really, they're challenging to negotiate, especially with material transfer agreements. You may not be able to receive that material from any other source. You're really limited. So you really have to think creatively with these issues and have to work closely with colleagues across your campus. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I will add to that, this was a great reminder to me as well that, for those of us who, even maybe consider ourselves seasoned research administrators, there's always new things to learn. And particularly if you find yourself in a position where you are moving to another state, and then going to another state institution, that you want to make sure that you get up to speed and talk with your colleagues at your new institution to learn the specific laws and regulations that may apply to your state and come into play. And you may also encounter this even if you are not moving institutions, but you're working on an agreement with a contracting party that is a state institution from another state, and they may have some specific compliance needs that need to be addressed within the contract. But overall, the main takeaway for compliance issues that we want to impart to you all is that in order to ensure that your contracts officers or whomever on your campus is responsible for the negotiation of unfunded agreements should maintain at least a basic understanding of the various compliance issues that might arise and know where they can go to for guidance at your institution. It's really helpful to make sure that there is some initial and ongoing training for those contracts officers so that they can be aware of the red flags or indicators for the various compliance issues, so they know what to look out for and they know whom to reach out to when they come across those indicators to make sure that all the compliance requirements are met. Next slide, please.
So I'd quickly like to thank colleagues from a couple of different institutions, Kareem Hussein, who's currently at the University of California, San Francisco, and Katarina Tang at the University of California, San Diego. They collaborated on developing an article that was sort of the starting point for this presentation. They work closely with unfunded agreements at their respective institutions and understood how essential they are to the research enterprise.
And we would also like to thank our outstanding contracts team at the University of Central Florida, who handle a high volume of complex agreements on a daily basis with efficiency and professionalism, and who embody many of the best practices that we have discussed here today.
All right. So we have a couple of questions in the chat here. Is your ERA system in the cloud or on premises? I believe it's in the cloud, but I haven't confirmed that. Yes, Becca, it's in the cloud?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. There can also be a rush associated, such as to get the agreement in place for a proposal submission. Absolutely. It's not infrequent that an NDA is required to start conversations about developing a proposal, or it could be that a teaming agreement is required or an allocation of rights agreement is required by a sponsor. So it has to be in place and negotiated prior to submission of a proposal. And having a contracts office that is nimble and can move quickly to get something set up is important. Going back to data, knowing what's on your contracts officer's plate, identifying that opportunity to provide support when something like this urgent comes in. Who handles your master user agreements? Are you referring to master software use agreements? Yes. It depends. So I think the way that it's separated out here is, again, if we're procuring something and we're paying for it, then obviously that's going to go through our procurement office. We do work closely with our procurement office when they need some expertise on the research contracting side. So we'll collaborate with them. They also work with our general counsel office. But if we're setting up a master agreement that's a research contract that's non-financial for software use, that's going to go through our group. It's going to go through the contracts office. Becca, do you want to take that one?
Let's see, what ERA system does UCF use? We use the Huron Research Suite.
And want to give a thanks to our IT group and the Office of Research. A lot of what we can do is because they have enabled us to do it. So they really are important partners. And as I mentioned, they understand our business process, which is critical. They know what we're dealing with. They know that what information we need, and they're willing to work with us to get us that information.
Absolutely. I will echo that. I felt that the Huron system has worked very well for us, but that's in large part due to the excellent IT group that we have here that provides all of the backup and support to make sure that the system works for our needs and for our processes, and that we're able to get the data, as Jeff mentioned, so that we can really do the analytics that are very helpful to us in creating our contract office efficiencies.
Well, thank you, everyone. If there aren't any other questions, the presentation slides will be made available. Have you done semiconductor fab agreements? That is a really great question. Those are the most challenging unfunded agreements. They're working with those types of companies, the rights, the obligations, the confidentiality terms, trade secrets. If you want to connect with me after, happy to talk more about those agreements. I worked on them quite a bit at a previous institution, so I have a lot of direct experience with those. Happy to discuss them after. There might be another, what types of, Greg, feel free to reach out to me. I don't want to go over, and I can spend an hour and a half talking about those types of agreements. So.
Maybe that's another topic for next year's FRAC.
Next year's FRAC. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.